My experiences, like any other flood victim, are awful. In 2005, my husband and I were actually away in London when the house was flooded, and we lost everything at all, everything on the ground floor. We came back and we arrived at the Globe Inn on the Saturday afternoon, and there was just a lake before us and 2 rowing boats. And one of the guys said, "We can take you round to your house, but you can't get in because it's completely underwater."
Well, we were actually in Edinburgh, because we go to Edinburgh every year at the same time at Christmas, and we knew it was bad weather here, but I didn't think we would flood. And then on the Saturday there was awful rain, and I spoke to one of my neighbours, and she was keeping an eye on the flood defence, and we didn't think we would flood, but we actually did flood. And it was the fact that I couldn't do anything because I was stuck in Edinburgh.
I was very heavily pregnant with our second child. I was actually already, I think, 5 or 6 days overdue. And we got the warning through from the Environment Agency, because we'd set up to have the warnings, which was helpful. And of course then had to have a massive row about whether or not actually we were going to get flooded and whether we should actually do anything about it. Thankfully my husband persuaded me that we would actually move some of our goods and things upstairs.
My daughter was to go off and stay with her grandfather for the weekend. They were going to choose Christmas trees to bring back. We wanted to have a proper Christmas tree for that Christmas. And we got a phone call at 2 in the afternoon. They live out at Temple Sowerby, and they couldn't get through because of the amount of water on the hillsides. And he drives a big VW Tuscan, which can go through all sorts of terrain, and this thing wasn't doing it.
I cope better with the second flood rather than the first. Having spent only 4 months, 3 to 4 months in the property, people say, "Oh, you didn't lose much on the first one." The problem was we lost a lot because we'd not unpacked and it was all on the ground floor.
Well, I've been flooded out twice. The first time in 2005 and the second time in the Storm Desmond floods. The first time I was a single individual, and when you're on your own and when the water is creeping up past hip height, it's quite scary. And in fact, when the water is the same height inside as it is outside, it's even worse. So I was trapped upstairs for about 10 hours before the waters actually subsided.
And it's a really horrible feeling when you're sitting there knowing that it's coming and you have nowhere to go to. Luckily my daughter was off at her grandfather's, so she didn't have to sit through it. Sarah, my partner, was coming back late from the works do, and she hadn't had the picture of how bad it was going to be. But she was coming back late because of the works do finishing late. It was a Christmas party. So I went to bed knowing that probably something horrible was going to happen that night. And then it was 3 in the morning, thereabouts, when she woke me up and said she wanted to go downstairs. She hadn't slept a wink that night. So we went down to the kitchen and water was coming in. It was halfway up the kitchen, and it was like a pool just sitting there. And I thought at the time, well, that's not so bad, you know, a little bit of damage, we can mop that out and nothing much is going to happen. And then it moved, you could see a ripple, and it sort of crept an inch straight away. And I thought, that's not good. And then it stopped again, and it felt again like, well, this might be it. And then in 2 minutes, it came up another 3 feet towards where I was. Not height, but coming towards me. And at that point, we knew this was unstoppable. So we just went to bed.
That moment when I heard that the water was in the house, it kind of was just like, oh God, like it has actually happened. Because I think up until the moment that I knew that the water was in the house, I still think I believed that it wasn't going to happen. I don't know why, because all the signs were that it was, but I suppose I was holding out a faint hope that it wouldn't hit us.
I can't describe it really. In a way it was a relief, because it was done. You weren't left wondering, is it going to happen? It had actually happened. And I'm saying it was a relief, but having said that, it was just, you're sick to the pit of your stomach at the thought of it.
We actually watched the water come up round the back of the properties in daylight, and it was heartbreaking. You could see it coming, you'd done all you could, and you were hoping and hoping and hoping that it wasn't going to reach, but unfortunately it did.
And it was disappointing because we have flood barriers. We had this huge defence built, and we had bought a property in that area thinking it was going to be okay, and it wasn't.
One of my most vivid memories of the whole flooding experience was being in my mum's car driving down the M6 motorway from the Kingstown junction to the Warwick Road junction, and it being like driving on top of a sea. There was just water as far as we could see, and it was a bright sunny day, so the sunshine was glinting off the top of the water. I mean, it was beautiful for its devastation, really. And I just remember looking at it and thinking, Jesus, with that volume of water, it is just like, I can see why we flooded. Like, how could we not have flooded with that volume of water being around? I've never seen anything like it.
First thing I seen was mine and David's car absolutely destroyed. So I got out of the car, came round here, seen all the mud and debris, and it was awful. Put the key in the door, opened the door to find I had a grandmother clock absolutely in smithereens on that floor, pictures of my sister on that floor. There was a couch in that living room, had actually floated into this living room. There was mud, water, smell, it was horrible.
So when we got back to the house that morning, actually the water was still rising, so we couldn't get anywhere near the house, and still couldn't until much later on that afternoon, when some kind people from one of the mountain rescue teams, I'm sad to say I don't remember which one, helped us by ferrying a boat up to the front door of the house so we could do things like get nappies out and the pram out for the new baby and all sorts of things, because that was the point, I suppose, we realised that we weren't going to be in there for a while.
As I said before, I was really lucky my daughter wasn't in the house at the time. But it was when she came back in from staying at her granddad's. The whole of the ground floor was a complete and utter disaster. Everything was ripped out, covered in mud, and it was really hard to tell what was what. I mean, papers, belongings got thrown out, and she had made this little thing in class. It was like a little paper angel. You couldn't recognise anything with the mud on it, and she walked in from the granddad's car, and immediately in the living room she saw this little pool of mud with lots of dirt all over it, and she immediately recognised it. And it took about 2 hours to calm her down. She was heartbroken, and that's been the hard thing, seeing what happened to her and seeing how her notions of safety were just ripped away like that. That was the hardest part.
The thing that really upset me was photographs. It still upsets me. Family photographs. Just gone.
you can only wear one pair of shoes at a time, you can only wear one jacket at a time. These are the things that I discovered. But photographs, at the time, as far as I was aware, basically they just floated away. And those were the things, photographs of your young son, photographs of times past, they can never be brought back.
When you have a baby these days, you get given a red child health book that documents, that you can use to document, like when your child got their first tooth, when they took their first steps, which jabs they've had, how they performed for their weight when they were born. And my son's was in the bottom left-hand cabinet of the dresser in the dining room that I didn't touch those cupboards, and I don't know where it went. I didn't empty the house because I was in hospital with a new baby. So it just completely disappeared in amongst everything. And I'm sad that we haven't got that, because that was like I'm not one that remembers those kind of dates. So that was my record of those things, and I've lost it. So it's not the thing, but it's the record that it held. I think that's the important thing.
Family member was flooded on Tully Street off Warwick Road, and we managed to get them out with the Land Rover early on the Sunday morning. They were decanted with a number of other residents to the Crown and Mitre, and the Crown and Mitre also hosted a chap called Steve Gibbs. Steve Gibbs lived on Eldred Street, just off Warwick Road, so an immediate neighbour. And he was very eloquent and very forceful to bring many of the local representatives together. I think he got the county council, the city council, and somebody from the Environment Agency to talk to those people at the Crown and Mitre within a matter of days. And he energised me to look into this with a planner's hat on, if you like, to see why it was happening and where it was occurring and whether it had happened before. And it was quite a revelation. I discovered that there'd been 11 Desmonds since 1771. Which most people didn't know about. They can just remember 2005, 2015, and some can go back to 1968. But it happens quite regularly, and there's a lot of Carlisle developed on a floodplain, just like there is with any industrial revolution, town or city in this country. Carlisle's not unique, but it does have a rather big river that is susceptible to a catchment within the wettest part of the country.
I took a huge pay cut coming here to where I work now, and we had to make all sorts of economies in the first year to readjust down. And one of the things at the time, I thought, well, flood defences are there, we can take the risk for a year, because you have to readjust all of your economics. So we cancelled the insurance. I think this was 2010, and about halfway through the year we'd made all the readjustments, and I contacted insurance companies and nobody would touch us. So for about 4 years after that, occasionally I would pop down to the river and have a look, but not as much as people that I know had been through it once before. So yeah, we weren't insured.
The impact has mainly been emotional. You just worry. You worry every time it rains hard. My house is the riverbank, and I count the bricks of the bank opposite when it rains hard. And the higher they get, the more worried you are.
We're still dealing with it. It was really, really hard. It still is really, really hard. I've had to learn a whole lot of DIY myself. Drying the house, rebuilding, redecorating, reflooring, all of that kind of stuff. The house is dry. We got a certificate of dryness, so all of that's been done properly. Floorboards in some rooms had to be ripped up and put back in. Walls had to be replastered. I'm not a plasterer, so I got somebody in, but I had to do a lot of that work myself, as well as holding down the job full time. And it's been really, really stressful. It's been really hard on the family. I know people who've broken up since because of going through the floods, and even they were insured. But we're still together. I think that's the big thing out of it. We've come through, we've survived.
And the well-being of people following a flood is of serious concern, because it doesn't last 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. It can last for the rest of somebody's life to varying degrees. And we're hearing that more with studies of PTSD, etc. So it is of a great concern, particularly if people... There is a dilemma, isn't there, that if you investigate to find that things aren't being put right properly because the money isn't there, because it's a difficult thing to fix, that's giving many members of the public no confidence, and that confidence then increases the pressure on their own mental state and their own ability to cope with life and move on and leave it behind them. So it is, whatever you do, there's a downside to it, and there's as well as there being an upside.
I think the thing that I take is, I've worked with people like Paul from the Flood Defence Centre, and he kept talking to me about mental health support, and that a lot of people who'd been through the floods needed mental health support, not just the advice on how to dry your house, advice on where to go and which tradespeople to get, but the whole mental health side of things, because people have lost everything, families are broken up, people have moved out, given up, sold their houses for cheap to developers and seen them sold within 6 months at high price. But it's the mental health side of people who've gone through this. I've not called on it yet. I've refused to let myself go down that road. I've been busy with trying to make sure that the family's okay, busy with trying to make sure that my daughter has recovered from it, because a long time she would talk about, is it going to flood tonight? And she would start to look at the weather. When she starts to pick her books up from downstairs on a rainy night and takes them upstairs because she's worried that she might lose her books. And she's only 8, and that's a hard thing to try and live with, but I haven't had the time to sit and think about, I don't want to say feel sorry for myself, but I haven't had the time to sit and reflect. That will one day come, and hopefully I'll be in a place where if I need that support, it'll be there.
Well, I don't know about communities, but individually we've got flood defences for the house. My bedroom's on the ground floor, and we put our flood defences on the bedroom windows 3 weeks ago. And you know, they'll stay there for the whole winter because they're difficult to install, and once they're in, they might as well stay there because, you know, we're coming up to the winters are getting wetter, and it's one less job to do if we're on a flood alert.
They've had flood doors put on the front and back doors of the house. I don't believe that would work because the house hasn't been repointed in years, so I think it would just seep through the wall sort of from underneath. So I don't think that makes any difference particularly.
Communities, you need to do, if you live in a terraced house, it's pointless everybody on the terrace bar one putting flood defences in, because that one means that there's water in and it will get into every other terrace on the terrace.
The difficulty is that property level protection, as they call it, you know, sort of seals on cat flaps and door guards and floodgates are not practical in a flood like Desmond in Carlisle. I mean, it's the kind of thing you would see on the lower levels of flooding, you know, whether it's Somerset or in Norfolk. It's not designed for Carlisle. In fact, it's actually dangerous. If you start to put property level protection in where you're expecting more than a metre in flood, you really need to get out. If you stay in and you think the protection is there, then that's a major risk to life.
I think the best thing that we can do as a family living in a property that's going to get flooded, and that we can do in our community, is just be a bit more prepared and a bit more knowledgeable about what we do need to do when it happens again. So silly things like what it is that you move upstairs and where you should put it and why it makes sense to do that. So I mean, we moved our freezer upstairs, which seemed like a really logical thing to do. We plugged it in and everything. And then of course the electric went off and it defrosted all over our bedroom carpet, which we then had to replace, which we wouldn't have had to replace if we just left the bloody freezer downstairs and it had got flooded.
I think politics plays a huge part in it. I think the most disappointing thing is that whether you're a Brexiteer or a Remainer, and we're in that period of time now, there are disaster funds, and the government, both in 2005 and 2015, could have used and called on those funds. I mean, people complain about the amount of money we send over to the EU, but the governments haven't used up the money that they could have brought back, and there were emergency relief funds that could have come back in. So that's the big disappointment. There were promises of like the flood defences in 2005, which fooled people like myself, my neighbour Alan, into buying a house in that area thinking it would be safe, that you could raise a family and live there happily.
And nothing's been done with to improve the flood defences in Carlisle. And, you know, hundreds of people have been adversely affected. Some lives have been ruined. In the 2005 floods, some lives were lost. So flooding is a real issue.
There is quite a bit that's been going on in the background between the RMAs, that's the risk management authorities for flooding, and the community involvement is probably much better now than it has been in previous events. What I would like to see is that continue, but the money is probably not going to be sufficient to get what everybody wants.
It doesn't really feel like anything's happened since the floods in terms of anything being done to prevent it from happening again. Although, if I'm honest, I suppose I'm not even sure that anything could prevent it. So I'm not even sure I'm in that kind of crusade of trying to prevent the next flood, because I just think it's almost so inevitable, and the sheer volume of water just was something almost otherworldly. So I don't know how you could stop it.
From the Victorian period onwards, from the mid-1800s, we have been developing on floodplains, and therefore we have a series of serious floods. But if it's only 1 in 20 or 1 in 30 years, people have tended to accept that. Now it's been 1 in 10 years, because there have been 2 in quick succession, people are questioning whether that's really acceptable. And I don't think we're going to get a solution directly from government without pressure. We're not going to get a solution from the insurance industry without pressure. The only solution that I can see comes from the people that have been affected and those people that are assisting them.